Wei didn't think that there was any real hope of Lan Wangji drinking with him, so he lifted his head and downed the cup of wine. But to his surprise, after staring at him silently for a while, Lan Wangji gently pulled up his sleeve, stretched out his hand, and poured himself a cup of wine. After taking a moment to commit to his decision, he lifted the cup and slowly drained its contents. Han Guangjun, aren't you being a bit too considerate? Are you really going to drink with me? Wei Wuxian asked with some astonishment. The last time they drank, Wei Wuxian hadn't paid particularly close attention to the expression on his friend's face. This time, however, he took care to observe Lan Wangji meticulously. He closed his eyes as he drank, wearing a slight frown. After finishing the cup, he pursed his lips ever so subtly, and only then did he open his eyes again. A slight, watery shimmer was detectable in his eyes. Wei Wuxian rested his cheek on his hand and began to silently count. As expected, when he reached 8, Lan Wangji set his cup down, lay his forehead against his palm, and closed his eyes, and thus he fell asleep. Wei Wuxian was now entirely convinced. Lan Wangji did indeed fall asleep first and get drunk later. A strange, eager excitement surged within him, and in one gulp he finished off the remaining liquor in the pot, then stood up. Resting his hands behind his back, he paced back and forth across the room. Suddenly, he walked to Lan Wangji's side and leaned over him, lowering his head and whispering into his ear, "Lan Chan." There was no response. "Brother Wangji?" Wei Wuxian asked again. Lan Wangji's head was supported by his right hand, and his breathing was very slow and steady. Both his face and his hand were pale and flawless, like fine jade. The faint scent of sandalwood wafted off of him. The scent had originally been cold and somewhat somber, but now it was infused with the smell of wine. Wisps of warmth emerged from the cool fragrance, as though it had mixed with the sweet, inebriating note. It was a bit intoxicating. The aroma swirled around Wei Wuxian's lungs as he stood near Lan Wangji. Involuntarily, he sank lower, bringing himself closer. A hazy thought clouded his mind. Strange, why does it seem a bit hot? Though Wei Wuxian was entirely unaware of it, surrounded by the scent of sandalwood and wine, his face inched nearer to his friend's. His voice also sank lower, and he whispered in a teasing tone, "Second, bruh." Suddenly, a soft voice said, "Young master, young master." Wei Wuxian's face had already gotten so close to Lan Wangji that he could easily reach out and touch him, and the coquettish "brother" on his tongue was on the verge of passing between his lips. But the sound startled him awake, and his feet slipped beneath him, nearly sending him crashing to the ground. He immediately interposed himself between the voice and Lan Wangji, turning to the wooden window from which it had originated. From the window came a careful knock, and another whisper floated in through the spaces in the wood. "Young master." Only now did Wei Wuxian realize that his heart was beating rather quickly. He muttered another "strange," then composed himself, walked over, and lifted the window cover to discover a black-robed figure hanging upside down from the eaves outside, about to knock again. Abruptly, Wei Wuxian threw the window open, striking the figure in the head. The figure let out a quiet "ah," and, gripping the window panel with both hands, came face to face with Wangxian. A cold night wind blew in through the open window. When Ning's eyes were open, the expanse of deathly white was no more, and a pair of quiet, black pupils gazed back instead. For a quiet while, the two stared at each other in this position, one standing upright, the other dangling upside down. "Come down," Wangxian said. All of a sudden, when Ning slipped, no longer hooked to the eaves, he tumbled downward and crashed into the ground with a heavy thud. Wangxian wiped a non-existent layer of sweat off of his forehead. "We really picked the right place," he thought. It was fortunate that they had chosen this restaurant. For the sake of peace and quiet, the windows of the private room opened to a small grove instead of a pedestrian road. Wangxian propped the window open with a support pole, then stuck his upper body out of the window and looked down. Wen Ning's body was so heavy that his fall had created a human-shaped crater beneath him. But even as he was lying in the pit, his eyes were still fixed on Wangxian. Forcing his voice down, he whisper-shouted, "I told you to come down, not to go down. Come, do you understand?" Wen Ning inclined his neck, looked at him, and climbed out of the hole. He brushed the dirt off of his clothes and said hastily, "Oh, I'm coming." Once he was finished, he wrapped his arms around one of the restaurant's pillars, preparing to climb. "Stop," Wangxian said. "You just stay there. I'll come find you." He returned to Lan Wangji's side and leaned against his ear. "Lan-chan, oh Lan-chan, please stay asleep longer. I'll come back as soon as possible. Be a good boy, okay?" Once the last word left his lips, he felt his hand itch, and he couldn't help but brush the tip of his finger against Lan Wangji's eyelashes. The long lashes trembled slightly, and a shallow furrow appeared between the man's brows, making him appear somewhat uneasy. Wangxian retracted his claws and hopped out of the window, leaping between the branches near the rooftop a few times before landing on the ground. Right as he turned around, Wen Ning kneeled before him. "What are you doing?" Wangxian asked. Wen Ning said nothing, hanging his head. "Do you have to speak to me this way?" Wangxian said. "Young master, I'm sorry," Wen Ning said quietly. "Fine." As the word left Wangxian's lips, he also knelt in front of Wen Ning. Startled, Wen Ning hastily kowtowed to him, and Wangxian promptly kowtowed in return too. Wen Ning immediately leapt up in alarm. Only then did Wangxian stand back up. "Can't you stand straight while talking to me from the start, like you are now?" he said, dusting off his clothing. Wen Ning lowered his head, too nervous to speak. "When did you return to full consciousness?" Wangxian asked. "Just recently," Wen Ning replied. "Do you remember everything that happened while the nails were still stuck in your head?" "I remember some of it, but not everything. What do you remember?" "I remember being chained somewhere pitch black. I think someone would come check on me from time to time." "Do you remember who?" Wangxian asked. "No. I only remember someone hammering something into my head," Wen Ning replied. "It was probably Shi Yang. He took control of Song Lan with those nails as well. At one point, the little hooligan was a guest cultivator at the Lanling Jin clan. We just don't know if he acted on his own initiative or at the Lanling Jin clan's prompting." Wangxian thought for a moment, then continued. "It was probably the Lanling Jin clan. At that point, they'd already announced to the world that your bones had been ground to dust and scattered to the wind. I'm afraid that without the backing of the Jin clan, Yang wouldn't have been able to accomplish such a feat and also keep everyone in the dark. He paused before continuing. Then what happened? How did you get to Dafan Mountain? Afterward, I don't know how much time had passed, but I suddenly heard a clap, Wen Ning said. Young master, I heard you say, why aren't you awake yet? So I broke free from the chains and rushed out. That was the command Wangxian had issued to the 3 fierce corpses at Moor Manor. In the past, the Healing Patriarch had given a countless number of orders to the Ghost General, and thus Wen Ning had heard the first order Wangxian had issued upon his return to the world of the living. Consequently, though his mind had still been muddled, Wen Ning followed the other corpses' directions and Wangxian's commands toward Wangxian himself. The Lanling Jin clan knew the fact that they had secretly hidden away the Ghost General had to be kept from the public, or else the explosive news would not only damage their clan's reputation, but also cause a wave of panic. Thus, even though Wen Ning had escaped, they hadn't dared to raise the flags and beat the drums, demanding his recapture. Their hands were tied, so Wen Ning was left to wander around in confusion until he finally caught up with the summoning call of Wangxian's flute, and the two were successfully reunited. Wangxian sighed. You don't know how much time had passed. It's been well over 10 years. He paused. But it's been about the same amount of time for me as well. Do you want me to tell you about what's happened? I already heard some of it, Wen Ning replied. What have you heard? The burial mounds are gone, and the people, they're all gone too. In actuality, Wangxian had wanted to tell him a few amusing, inconsequential things, such as how the number of the Lan clan rules had increased from 3 to 4,000. He hadn't expected something so heavy and serious to come out of Wen Ning's mouth as soon as he opened it, and was thus rendered involuntarily speechless. Despite the gloominess of the topic, Wen Ning's tone was by no means grief-stricken. He seemed to have known for quite a while, and in fact, he had already learned of it long ago. Even back then, over a decade ago, they had anticipated the worst outcome many, many times. After a moment of silence, Wangxian said, What else have you heard? Zhang Cheng, Clan Chief Zhang, brought people to encircle and besiege the burial mounds. He killed you, sir. I have to clarify this. He didn't kill me. I died because one of my techniques backfired. Wen Ning lifted his eyes and looked at him directly. But, Clan Chief Zhang, he clearly... It's impossible for a person to walk on a lonely, single log bridge, safely and soundly, for an entire lifetime. It couldn't be helped. Wen Ning seemed to want to sigh, though he had no breath to sigh with. All right, enough, Wangxian said. Let's stop talking about him. Have you heard anything else? Yes, Wen Ning looked at him. Young Master Wei, you died such a terrible death. Seeing his morose expression, Wangxian said, Hey, haven't you heard any good news? Wen Ning frowned. Oh, no, I really haven't heard any. Wangxian found himself at a loss for words again. Abruptly, the loud and distinct sound of shattering porcelain came from the ground floor of the main hall. Lan Sidre's voice followed. Weren't we talking about Yang? Why do we have to start arguing about this? I'm talking about Yang, Jin Ning said in a rage. Did I say something wrong? What did Yang do? That piece of scum is worse than an animal, and Wei Ying was even more disgusting than he was. What do you mean you shouldn't lump different issues together? Any time we let those practitioners of evil arts live, catastrophe always follows. We should kill every last one of them and make them go extinct. Wen Ning shifted, but Wei Wuxian gestured for him to stay still. They heard Lan Jingyi interject. "Why are you so angry?" the boy blurted out. "It's not like Sidrui said Wei Wuxian shouldn't have been killed. He only said that it's possible that not everyone who practices demonic cultivation is like Xue Yang. Is it necessary to fling things everywhere? I haven't had a chance to taste that yet." Jinling sneered. Didn't he also say that the inventor of those methods didn't necessarily want to use them for evil? Who was the inventor of those methods? Tell me, who else could it be but Wei Ying? I don't understand. Isn't your Gusu Lan clan also a prominent cultivation clan? Didn't a lot of your people die at Wei Ying's hand too? Wasn't it a headache killing all the walking corpses and all his other scummy followers? Why are you taking such a strange position, Lan Yuan? Based on what you said just then, aren't you trying to let Wei Ying off the hook? Lan Yuan was Lan Sidrui's birth name. I'm not trying to let him off the hook at all, he explained. I only wanted to propose that since we don't know exactly what the circumstances were, we shouldn't draw any definite conclusions. Before we went to Yi City, didn't a lot of people claim that Xia Xingchen Daozhang killed the Yueyang Chang clan's Changping in angry vengeance? And how did it turn out in reality? Whether Changping was killed by Xiao Xingchen or not, no one saw. Everyone was just speculating. How were they claiming anything? But the slaughter Wei Ying committed at Chongqi Road, the bloodbath at the Nightless Heavens. Between those two battles, how many cultivators lost their lives at his hands? At the hands of Wen Ning and the Yin Tiger Tally. Countless people saw the facts with their own eyes. They're undeniable, incontestable. He killed my mother and made Wen Ning kill my father. That I'll never forget. If there had been any hint of blood in Wen Ning's complexion, it all would have certainly drained away at this point. Miss Jiang's son, he said quietly. Wei Wuxian remained completely still. Jinling spoke again. My uncle grew up with him, and my grandfather saw him as his own child. My grandmother didn't mistreat him either. But him, because of him, Lotus Pier got turned into those Wen clan scum's evil lair. Because of him, the Yunmeng Zhang clan was decimated and scattered to the wind. Because of him, my grandmother and grandfather died together, and now my uncle is the only one left. He only has himself to blame for his inevitable death. In the end, all of the winds and waves he stirred up left him with a dismembered, mutilated corpse. What's there to be unclear about exactly? What could he possibly be let off the hook for? Lan Sidrui did not reply to Jinling's aggressive tirade. After a long pause, another boy spoke. All right. Why are we fighting over this? Let's just drop the subject, okay? We're supposed to be eating. The food's starting to get cold. The voice belonged to the disciple who Wei Wuxian had dubbed a passionate type. Another person seconded the sentiment. Zijin is right. Let's stop arguing. Sidrui was just speaking carelessly, that's all. It's just idle talk. How could he have given it so much thought? Young Master Jin, why don't you sit down? Let's eat together. Yeah, we all just escaped from Yi City. Aren't we basically fire-forged friends now? Why do we need to fight over a careless slip of the tongue? Jinling harumphed. Only now did Lan Sidrui speak up again, still in a courteous tone. I apologize. I was thoughtless and misspoke. Young Master Jin, please sit. If we continue to quarrel, we might draw Han Guangjun's attention and make him come down here. That would be no good. Sure enough, the mention of Han Guangjun was remarkably effective, and Jinling immediately stopped grumbling. Wei Wuxian heard the sounds of tables and chairs being rearranged, and then the boys seemed to sit down. The hall grew noisy once again, and their voices were quickly drowned out by the clicks of chopsticks and the clinks of cups and plates. But Wei Wuxian and Wen Ning continued to stand silently in the grove, somber expressions on their faces. Without sound or breath, Wen Ning sank to his knees once again. It took Wei Wuxian quite some time to notice. He waved his hand weakly. It has nothing to do with you. Wen Ning was about to open his mouth and reply, when suddenly he was startled by the sight of something behind Wei Wuxian. Just as the latter was about to turn and look, a set of white robes fluttered past him. The owner lifted his foot and kicked Wen Ning in the shoulder. Wen Ning made another human-shaped crater as he crashed into the ground. Lan Hongji appeared to want to kick Wen Ning again. Hastily, Wei Wuxian pulled him back. Han Guangjun, calm down, he said repeatedly. The sleeping phase had seemingly passed, and the drunk phase had arrived. Lan Hongji had found his way out. The circumstances seemed strangely familiar. History truly had an astonishing way of repeating itself. But this time, Lan Hongji looked even more normal than the last time. He wasn't wearing his boots reversed, and even while he did something as inelegant and crude as kicking Wen Ning, the expression on his face was as solemn, proper, and admirably righteous as ever. It was impossible to pick out a single flaw. After being pulled back by Wei Wuxian, he shook his sleeves, nodded, and stood proudly back where he started, complying with Wei Wuxian's request to stop kicking. How are you doing? Wei Wuxian asked Wen Ning, seizing the opportunity. I'm fine, Wen Ning replied. If you're fine, get up. Why are you still kneeling? Wen Ning climbed back up. After a moment's hesitation, he said, Young Master Lan. Lan Hongji frowned, covered his ears, and turned his back on Wen Ning and toward Wei Wuxian, blocking the latter's line of sight with his body. Wen Ning was speechless. It's best if you don't stand there, Wei Wuxian said. Lan Chan, doesn't like seeing you. Is something wrong with young Master Lan? It's nothing, he's just drunk. Huh? Wen Ning seemed to be at a loss and unable to process this information. After quite some time had passed, he finally spoke again. Then, what should we do? What else can we do? I'll bring him back to the room and throw him onto the bed. Yes, Lan Hongji said. Huh? Aren't you blocking your ears? How can you hear what I'm saying? Wei Wuxian asked. This time, Lan Hongji didn't reply, but continued to cover his ears tightly, as though the person who had just interjected wasn't him. Wei Wuxian was torn between laughter and despair. Be careful, he said to Wen Ning. Wen Ning nodded, but couldn't help but glance at Lan Hongji. Just as he was about to take his leave, Wei Wuxian called out to him again, stopping him in his tracks. Wen Ning, it might be better if you find somewhere to hide instead. Wen Ning looked dazed. You've basically died twice now. Go and get a good rest, Wei Wuxian added. After waiting for Wen Ning to leave, he pulled Lan Hongji's hands away from his ears. All right, he's gone. You won't hear or see him any longer. Finally, Lan Hongji relaxed his hands. He stared blankly at Wei Wuxian through his pale eyes. His gaze was a bit too honest and pure. Wei Wuxian's desire to make mischief surged violently upward, as though someone had lit a fire inside him. Lan Chan, he said with an evil smile. Are you still going to answer any question I ask and do anything I say. Lanongji replied. Take off your forehead ribbon. Lanongji did indeed reach toward the back of his head and slowly undid the knot, removing the white, cloud-patterned sash. Wei Wuxian took the ribbon into his hand and turned it over several times, scrutinizing it carefully for a while. There's nothing that extraordinary about it. Until I thought it was hiding some earth-shattering secret. So why did you always get so angry whenever I plucked it off you back then? Could the old Lan Wangji have hated him so much that he had simply hated everything Wei Wuxian did? Suddenly, he felt something tighten around his wrist. He looked up and saw that Lan Wangji had bound his hands together with the forehead ribbon and was now leisurely tying the ends into knots. What did you do that for? Wei Wuxian asked. Curious to see exactly what Lan Wangji was doing, he let his friend proceed as he wished. Lan Wangji bound Wei Wuxian's hands together very tightly, tying a slip knot at first. But after a moment's thought, he appeared to find the knot unsuitable and undid it, retying the ribbon with a dead knot. After another moment's thought, he still didn't appear satisfied and tied another knot on top of the first. The trailing portion of the Gusu Lan clan's forehead ribbon typically dangled down, fluttering freely. It was a beautiful sight, and for the sake of such, the ribbon was very long. Lan Wangji proceeded to tie 7 or 8 dead knots in a row, forming a string of small, ugly lumps. Finally, he seemed satisfied and stopped. Hey, do you still want your forehead ribbon or not? Wei Wuxian asked. Lan Wangji's brow unfurrowed. Holding the other end of the ribbon, he hoisted Wei Wuxian's hands up to eye level, as though to admire his own grand masterpiece. It's like I'm a criminal, Wei Wuxian thought, as his hands were suspended in the air. No, wait. Why do I have to let him play around with me like this? Shouldn't I be the one messing with him? Startled awake, Wei Wuxian said, Untie me. Cheerfully, Lan Wangji stretched out his hand and repeated his earlier trick, reaching toward Wei Wuxian's collar and the sash around his robes. No, don't untie that. Untie my hands. Undo the thing you tied me up with, the forehead ribbon. The image of Lan Wangji removing all of Wei Wuxian's clothes while his hands were still bound was terrifying to just contemplate. Lan Wangji frowned when he heard his friend's request, and he stood completely still for a long time. Wei Wuxian lifted his hands so that he could see. Aren't you supposed to listen to what I say? He coaxed. Untie this for me. Be a good boy. After glancing at him, Lan Wangji calmly looked away, as though he was unable to understand what Wei Wuxian was saying, and had to expend some effort figuring it out. Oh, I understand now, Wei Wuxian shouted. If I ask you to tie me up, you'll do it very enthusiastically. But if I ask you to untie me, then you don't understand what I'm saying, right? The Lan clan's forehead ribbons were made out of the same type of material as their robes. Though the cloth appeared light and floaty, in reality, its durability and strength were unmatched. Not only had Lan Wangji bound Wei Wuxian's hands together very tightly, he had also tied a long series of dead knots. Thus, no matter how much Wei Wuxian twisted and struggled, he was unable to free himself. I really shot myself in the foot. Luckily, it's only a forehead ribbon and not some magical rope or similar infernal thing. Or else I'll be hog-tied instead, he thought. As Lan Wangji surveyed the distance, he tugged on the forehead ribbon and swung it back and forth, seemingly enjoying himself immensely. Please untie me, Wei Wuxian begged pitifully. Hanguang-jun, how could someone as cultivated and refined as you do something like this? What are you trying to accomplish by tying me up like this? Wouldn't it be terrible if someone else saw? What would you do then? Upon hearing his last few words, Lanangji began pulling him toward the exit of the grove. You wait just a second, Wei Wuxian said, stumbling as he was being dragged. I meant it would be bad if someone else saw, not that you should show this to someone. Hey, you're just pretending that you can't hear me. You're pretending that you can't understand me, aren't you? You only understand what you want to understand. Isn't that right? Lanchan, Lan Wangji. Before he had finished speaking, Lanangji had already lugged him out of the grove and back onto the street. They re-entered the restaurant's ground floor main hall. The junior disciples were still in the middle of eating, drinking, bantering, and merrymaking. Though they had a bit of an unpleasant exchange earlier, young people were capable of forgetting a bit of unpleasantness quite quickly. At the moment, they were playing a drinking game. A few of the braver Lan juniors wanted to sneak a drink or two, so at least one of them had an eye on the stairs to the second floor at any given time, to guard against Lan Wangji finding out. None of them anticipated that he would suddenly drag Wei Wuxian through the unguarded main entrance. Their heads turned, and each wore a look of blank shock. Several clanks and bangs rang out as Lan Jingyi rushed to hide the cups of alcohol on the table, knocking over several dishes in the process. It was completely ineffective at concealing anything. Indeed, instead of hiding their indiscretions, it only made them more conspicuous. Lan Sidrui stood up. Han Guangjun, why did you come in from over there? Wei Wuxian laughed. Your Han Guangjun felt a bit hot sitting inside the room, so we went out for some fresh air. We decided to ambush you guys on a whim, and sure enough, we caught you drinking in secret. Internally, he prayed that Lan Chan would haul him directly up the stairs without speaking to anyone or doing anything unnecessary. As long as his friend stayed silent and maintained his frosty exterior, no one would notice anything off about him. Just as the thought passed through his head, Lanangji started dragging him toward the boys' table. A very startled Lan Sidrui exclaimed, Han Guangjun, your forehead ribbon. Before he even finished his sentence, he noticed Wei Wuxian's wrists. Han Guangjun's forehead ribbon was tied around them. As though not enough people had taken note, Lanangji pulled the ends of the forehead ribbon upward, lifting Wei Wuxian's hands up with them, exhibiting his handiwork so everyone could see.